Blair and Bush were simply lying when they said that they were trying to work for a diplomatic settlement. They'd already started the war. Okay, that came out in the famous Downing Street memos in England, but it hadn't been officially announced. But there were huge demonstrations, and I think they had an effect. The U.S. war in Iraq was horrible enough. Probably killed about 1 million people, drove a couple of million out of the country, devastated the country, destroyed it. Horrible cultural destruction and so on. It was pretty awful. Could have been a lot worse. It's not what the U.S. did in South Vietnam. Nothing like it. No saturation bombing with B-52s, chemical warfare, and so on. And I think it was retarded by the anti-war movement. The population here had just become more civilized. That's one of those grim effects of the 1960s.
And Afghanistan.
Pardon?
And Afghanistan.
Afghanistan is an interesting case. Afghanistan was sold here as a war to retaliate, to adjust. It's always called a just war, to prevent terror, retaliate against a terrorist attack. It's such a standard view that to take it apart, requires more time than I'd be allowed. But the fact of the matter is that was not the goal of the war. If the goal of the war was to isolate al-Qaeda, eliminate terror, there were straightforward ways to proceed. If you go back to that time, the jihadi movement itself was highly critical of the 9/11 attack. There were fatwas coming out from the most radical clerics in, Al-Azhar University, the main theological center, denouncing al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden, and the terrorist attacks on Islamic, we don't want to do that, and so on. Well, if you wanted to end terror, the obvious thing to do at that point is to isolate al-Qaeda, to try to gain support, even from the jihadi movement, and of course from the population they're trying to mobilize. Terrorists regard themselves as a vanguard. They're trying to mobilize others to their cause. Every specialist on terrorism knows that. So you could have done it then, and you could have proceeded to identify the perpetrators, which incidentally they couldn't do because they didn't know who they were. And that was conceded later. But you could have tried to identify them, bring them to justice, to trials, with fair trials, not torture, but fair trials, which would have probably sharply reduced, if maybe even have ended Islamic terrorism. Well, they did the opposite. What they tried to do is to mobilize the population and mobilize the jihadi movement to support al-Qaeda. That's exactly the effect of first invading Afghanistan and later invading Iraq. And it's also the effect of Guantanamo and Bagram and the other torture centers. Everyone who's involved in them, serious knows, they created terrorists.
Do you think Obama should have these Guantanamo prisoners tried in New York?
Well, it depends whether we want to regard ourselves as a civilized country, as a rogue state. If you want to be a rogue state, do whatever you like, kill them, torture them, whatever. If you want to be part of the civilized world, and also if you want to reduce the appeal of the extreme jihadi movement, then try them in civilian courts. In fact, the very fact that they're in Guantanamo is outlandish. First of all, what's Guantanamo? Guantanamo was taken from Cuba a century ago at gunpoint. They said, give us Guantanamo or else. Cuba was under military occupation. It's called a treaty, but, okay. But, and the Treaty of Guantanamo, if you want to call it that, allowed Guantanamo to be used as a coaling station for the Navy. Well, it's not what it's being used for. In fact, as you know perfectly well, it was used for Haitian refugees. When Haitians were fleeing from the dictatorships that the U.S. was supporting, the U.S. refused to permit them political asylum. It claimed that they were just economic refugees. And the Coast Guard tried to stop them, and if any got through, they sent them to Guantanamo. Okay, and now you know what they're being used for. Actually, what they are being used for is to create terrorists. It's not my opinion. That's the opinion of the main U.S. interrogators, people like Matthew Alexander, who actually has an article on it in the same issue of National Interest that I mentioned. So yeah, it's a great way to create terrorists. It inspires terrorism all over, and it turns many of these people there into terrorists, even if they were picked up for whatever reason it was. So yes, if you want to, if your goal is to reduce the threat of, say, Islamic terrorism, and to become part of the civilized world, you have civilian trials. Just as those who are in Guantanamo, first of all, most of those who are in Guantanamo, I mean, it's kind of outrageous anyway. So like some 15-year-old kid who was found holding a rifle when the U.S. is invading his country. That's a terrorist, Okay, but that's a large part of maybe almost all of what's in Guantanamo. But if you want it, but what should have been done with them, if the goal was to be civilized and to reduce terrorism, is to put them in prison in the United States. There's no security problem. They're not going to get out of a maximum security prison, and they don't have some magic way of spreading poison around the world or anything. But of course, the government didn't want to do that because it had no evidence. And if they were sent to Guantanamo so that they could, it was hoped, be free from U.S. jurisdiction, so you could pretend that they weren't under U.S. jurisdiction, so the laws didn't apply. Well, the Supreme Court finally, after a long time, kind of whittled away at that and said, yes, they have the right of habeas corpus. The Bush administration accepted that. Obama doesn't. The Obama administration is trying to overturn a decision by a right-wing Bush judicial appointee that the Supreme Court decision holds for Bagram, the torture center in Afghanistan. And the Obama administration is trying to override that, so that means that the Supreme Court decision is just a joke. If you want to torture somebody, don't send them to Guantanamo because the Supreme Court said you can't torture them there. Send them to Bagram. So if you pick somebody up in Yemen or wherever you pick them up, and you want them not to be subject to international law, also U.S. law, okay, send them to Bagram. That's the Obama administration position. I mean, it's for reasons like these that even the most hawkish terrorism specialists, people like Michael Scheuer, who was in charge for the CIA of following Obama for years, he says that Al-Qaeda's, Osama bin Laden's best ally is the United States. We're doing exactly what he wants. What he wants is trying to sell a line to the Muslim world. These guys are on a crusade. They're trying to kill us. We've got to defend ourselves. And the U.S. is acting, as if they're under command. We do everything he wants.
MIT professor Noam Chomsky in a public conversation at Harvard University. If you want a copy of today's program, you can go to our website at democracynow.org. We'll come back to our conversation after break. Stay with us.
والذي يعرف رد ينحني ويصلي لإله في العيون العسلية بين رد وعيوني بندقية والذي يعرف رد ينحني ويصلي.
Rita by Marcel Khalife here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As we return now to the conclusion of our public conversation with Noam Chomsky, professor of linguistics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. We were speaking at Harvard Memorial Church in Cambridge, Massachusetts. We talked about the risk he took as an anti-war activist. But first, I asked him about what he thought of the Obama administration, what it should be doing with Israel and Palestine.